Good evening, everybody. Welcome to A5. E5, you passed the first test, which was finding the room. It's not quite easy. There's numbering here in the Hauptgebäude. My name is Chris Lubkeman. I have the great pleasure and privilege to be the head of the Foresight team, the Foresight Hub within the Office of the President. And I will be your host for today's lecture, The Wild, Unexpected Exponential Ride Through Computer Graphics. The ETH Global Lecture Series is a platform for contemporary topics to be discussed with outstanding global thinkers, and tonight we definitely have not only a global thinker, but also a global doer, two of them with us. We like to bring amazing people together to discuss their personal insights, interests, experiences, and their expertise. In addition to simply satisfying our curiosity to learn, we also hope that these dialogues will expand our perspectives so we can broaden our thinking, challenge our opinions, and through this, make an even more meaningful contribution to society. The lectures are all recorded and online. For those who haven't been able to see some of the earlier ones, you're welcome to go there. And this one will also be recorded online if you'd like to share it afterwards with friends, colleagues who couldn't be here tonight, because this was sold out literally in 30 hours, which is the first time we've had it go that fast. I moved to Marin County, just north of San Francisco from London about 22 years ago. And I went there because of the natural beauty, the amazing, stunning natural environment, the beaches, etc. And also, it was known as a creative hub. And when I moved there, I was told about this company, which I frankly had never really heard about, ILM, which lots of people in Marin County sort of spoke about with awe, with a personal relationship, having worked there or known people who've worked there. And I really didn't know much about ILM. I enjoyed many movies, which I subsequently found out were through ILM support. And one day I got to go to the Canner Boulevard to the Mecca, and someone pointed it out to me where it was. But I had no real relationship to it. When we had this lecture announced, Jörg Brunschweiler, who is the leader of the Office of the President team, he came out of his office so excited that we here were able to have this lecture from Ed Catmull. And I looked at him going, okay, great. Who's Ed? Subsequently, I have found out, which is why you are here. In my previous world, I also had the very great privilege of working with Disney Imagineering, looking at the future of theme parks. And through that, got an inside view of some of the creative genius which sits within that organization, and especially within their leaders. And tonight, Ed will be introduced by a faculty member, one of these incredible leaders, who's Professor Markus Gross, who has an amazing, also illustrious career. He's a chief scientist of Walt Disney Studios, which I think is probably a pretty cool thing. I can't really imagine exactly what it is, but it's pretty amazing. He's one of the leading authorities on visual computing, computer animation, digital humans, virtual reality, and AI. In his role at Disney, he leads the Studio Segments Research and Development Unit, where he and his team are pushing the forefront of technology innovation in the service of filmmaking in many ways, the way Ed did a while ago as well. So it is my great pleasure and privilege to bring Markus up here to introduce Ed to you. And let's give him a welcome round of applause.
All right, so thank you very much, Chris. This is very kind words. And as a matter of fact, I get this question very often. They ask me, what is a chief scientist in the world's largest film studio? Well, you know, the film is going technical, and technology innovation is a big deal, and I think we'll also hear more about this today. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to tonight's ETH Global Lecture. Also in the name of the Department of Computer Science, who co-hosts the event. It is a great honor and pleasure, and I'm enormously proud to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Ed Catmull. Ed Catmull is a true legend. Many of you might know him as the co-founder and the brain behind the Pixar animation studios and as his president for 33 years. And I think the company he created exemplifies the magic that can happen if you bring the best of the arts and the best of technology and sciences together. Some others might know him as a New York Times bestseller author with his book Creativity, Inc. Hopefully you all read it. And yet others know him as the recipient of the 2019 ACM Turing Award, which is the Nobel Prize in Computer Science, which he shares with Pat Henran from Stanford. And finally, some of you, my gosh, who's that? Some of them, oh my God, I didn't turn this off. And some of you might associate him with the 2 Oscars and the several Academy Awards he won. In fact, he and Pat Henran are probably the only individuals on the planet who have received both an Oscar and a Turing Award, which is quite remarkable. Only a few of you might know that Ed was the driving force, the initiator, and the protector of Disney research here in Zurich for a very long time. Before retiring from Disney, Ed served as the president not only of the Pixar Animation Studios, but also of our feature animation, the Disney Animation Studios as well. He started his career at the University of Utah, which some of you might know is the cradle of computer graphics, where he received a bachelor and a PhD in computer science. He is also the inventor of the so-called Catmull-Clark subdivision surfaces. That's a class of surface representations that has become very, very important in geometric modeling and in computer graphics as a whole. And before founding Pixar, as Ed was the founding director of the New York Institute of Technology, it was a private research institute who really pioneered computer animated short films. And also, he created the computer division of Lucasfilm, which would later be bought out by Steve Jobs and turned into Pixar, whom Ed was actually very close as a friend. Finally, on a personal note, throughout my years at Disney, Ed had been a dear friend and mentor to me, who gave me advice and guidance on how to navigate the rocky waters of corporate Hollywood. Tonight, Ed will talk about the wild, unexpected exponential ride through computer graphics. Please join me with a round of applause for our speaker, Ed Catmull.
Working? Pardon? Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Oh, great. I can't live up to this. Well, obviously I'm wearing a SIGGRAPH shirt. I've spent about 50 years of my life with SIGGRAPH, my entire professional life. What I want to try to do is to give you a rapid overview of 50 years, which means I'm going to try to stay pretty strictly to script here, because I have a lot of rabbit holes I can go down in and never come out. So when I say exponential, it's like things have been building slowly and they increase over time. And I'm going to try to capture that in sort of like 3 different phases, each one going faster than the other. A lot of this increasing improvement wasn't just because of Moore's law, the increasing speed of computers. It was also because of the general increase of knowledge that people gained and the increasing number of people that entered into the field, and this rather remarkable interchange to be part of. I will, as I say, I will tell this, but it's also, just to be clear, through the lens of what I experienced. And all I can do is give some of those experiences and some of the lessons that I learned along the way. I originally wanted to be an animator. So when I was in high school, I was a good artist. But as I got near graduation, I realized that I was nowhere good enough. So I switched over into physics. Now think about it. I've said that before, and there's that same reaction, which is, okay, you went from art to physics. But the implication is it's like somehow physics and the arts are incongruous, right? And so that's what it means when it seems kind of humorous. But it shouldn't be, right? They should be more aligned with each other in terms of the way we think about it. Okay, so when I was graduating, getting close to graduate from college, I did get my degree in physics, but I got a second degree in computer science. So I had 2 different bachelor's degrees, largely because I took a lot of classes. But near the end of graduation, I took a course from Alan Kay. And Alan Kay taught this computer science course, and it blew my mind. It's like, it utterly transformed what I wanted to do, because I wanted to be at the frontier, and here's where the frontier was. This is where the exciting problems were. So I then decided to go to graduate school in computer science, because I wanted to study computer science. In particular, I wanted to study artificial intelligence, machine learning. So the first class I took, though, was one in computer graphics. It's taught by Ivan Sutherland. So this is pretty amazing, because 2 of my first teachers were foundational people in computer science and computer graphics, both of whom received Turing Awards because of what they had done. So that's pretty lucky to get to a place where these were the 2 teachers that I had. So as just in terms of the lessons I learned at the time, the first one was from Alan Kay, because Alan believed and taught the fact that you can't do something now, but if you imagine it, then you can sort of emulate it. You can try to figure out what it is to get there. That's kind of abstract, but just to give an example, in 1969, while Alan was still a graduate student, he gave a talk at an ACM conference in Las Vegas. And at that conference, he basically was saying that he believed that machine power would get to the point where you could have a computer like on a laptop with a fold-up screen. And he showed a mock-up of it. And the image on the mock-up was an image that was generated by the computer graphics group there at Utah. And at the end of the speech, it was open for questions, and people came up to the microphone to ask questions about it. But one of the people that came up to ask a question or to talk was the president of the ACM at that time. And he ripped into Alan Kay, telling him that he thought it was dishonest for him to have said that this is going to be a thing that's happened, and that it was dishonest to use that image on the screen. I'm in the audience. Now, first of all, it was clear to me that Alan was right. What wasn't clear to me is, why did the president of ACM think that this was a bad thing to do? And I realized that the notion of large change or exponential is not obvious to a lot of people and wasn't obvious to him. And so the lesson I came from it away with was that I didn't want to be caught in the trap of like linearly projecting where we are right now and not understanding of the implications of great change. So the other lessons came from Ivan Sutherland. Now, Ivan Sutherland, when he was at MIT, or was actually at Harvard, he was at both places. I think he did this at Harvard. He built and implemented the first VR and AR. So this is like 53 years ago, and it was implemented, and you could put on this headset, you could see this image, wireframe images is what you saw, and move around it, and you could also lift the lens up and you could see through the image, a mirror. So essentially, I think it was like 4 years ago in which there was the 50th anniversary of him having done this. And he did these profound things when he was a graduate student. It was really, actually, he was scary smart. But when he came to Utah with Dave Evans, they set up a program funded by ARPA, which was to develop computer graphics, which at that time consisted of drawing lines. And what they wanted to do was to have a step-by-step program to advance the algorithms and the science of making images on the computer. And so that's what I walked into was, we're now going step-by-step through this. And so one of the students just before me was John Warnock, who founded Adobe. And he did an algorithm for doing hidden polygons, because that's all they could do at the time were polygons. And the reason is the memories were very small. You couldn't do anything more than one scan line at a time because of these small memories. But he had an algorithm which worked for polygons. And then another graduate student came up with another algorithm which could be implemented in hardware, which was then the basis for an aircraft simulation package that they built later. And then somebody came up with an algorithm for smoothly shading it, because rather than having the fastest of polygon, you wanted to have it look smooth. And then somebody had a step to make it look even smoother. That's when I took this class from Ivan while this is going on. And I thought, well, this is really cool, but I can now combine my desire to do art and animation with the technology. So I thought, well, what I would do is digitize my left hand and make this polygonal version of it and then animate it. So I did that in 1972, I think is when that happened. So I thought, well, this is really cool. So I went to Ivan and said, okay, this is what I want to do. And he said, okay, well, the next step is we want to figure out how to bend the edges, because even though we made the polygons look smooth, they still had polygonal edges, which are quite noticeable. You didn't have that many polygons in the picture. So he said, bend the silhouettes. So I spent a lot of time thinking about silhouettes, realized that there was a fundamental problem of why it couldn't be done, and as a practical matter. And what I needed to do was to actually come up with a way of displaying curved patches directly. Now, the problem is, there's no memory on these computers. But Alan said what you do is you emulate the future. Well, at some point we're going to have enough memory, so maybe I can fake having the memory. But computers didn't have paging algorithms at the time, or paging systems. So I just made up my own to page the full image and the depth buffer, and then bring it in and out of the small memory. It wasn't very fast, but I could render a curved surface that way. And once I could render a curved surface using B-splines, which is now mathematically well-defined, not only did I have curved surfaces, I could calculate how to do the anti-aliasing so you didn't have those jagged edges. I don't know if you're old enough to remember those jagged edges, but they were pretty obnoxious. So I got rid of that. And I could then map images onto it. So this is the origin of texture mapping, because I could do it. And then I was writing that up. And I was working on other things too in terms of service mathematics. And other people then took other steps forward, which is the point was you keep adding on to what's being done. Now, there was one other thing I did there that I'm proud of, but it was kind of an odd incident, although it was a lesson for me. I knew there was a problem with making things up with four-sided patches. If you have something complicated, like a hand. I mean, it's not, it's actually a pretty amazing thing that our body has, but representing it with the surface with four-sided patches coming together with 4 1/4 doesn't work very well. Well, we had a lot of people with seminars working on mathematical surfaces, and I had this idea about how to approach it, which was to take the B-spline patch and reverse engineer the math. So I turned it into a set of rules and operations to work geometrically. And I proved that this worked by using high school geometry. It was an 18-page handwritten proof of why this would work. And once I had these rules, I could apply it to non-four-sided things. Oh, this is pretty cool. Wasn't part of my thesis, but I thought it was pretty cool. So I took it to one of the professors who'd been brought in, who was an expert in curved surfaces, and had come up with one of the advances in curved surfaces called NURBS. So I showed him an 18-page proof. He looked at it briefly, tossed it back at me and said, "Ed, what is this shit?" Well, it wasn't part of my thesis, so I set it to the side. And then I left, went out to New York Tech. And then Jim Clark came out to work for me for a while. This is the same Jim Clark who later founded Silicon Graphics and a good friend. And I showed him the paper, and he said, "Well, this is really cool." So he implemented it, and then we wrote it up as a paper, got it published. And then years later, a professor at University of Washington implemented it, added something to it. And when he showed it to me at SIGGRAPH, his conference, I said, "Well, that's really cool." And so I hired him to run R&D at Pixar, and he came down, and we put it into a short. And our first short that he worked on was Jerry's Game. Remember, that's the old man that plays chess with himself. And then we immediately used it in the next film, and every Pixar film since then. And then we made it open source and available across the industry. And today it's the primary modeling tool in the film industry. Sometimes it just takes a long time to get shit done. Anyway, back to the Utah story. I graduated, and well, actually, I'm sorry, before I graduated, as I indicated, I wanted to do something with animation, which meant that basically I would need to do something with Disney. And Ivan knew this, and Ivan wanted to bring an animator out from Disney and send a grad student out to Disney, sort of an exchange of information. So he sent me to Burbank, and I met some of the people who made the films that I grew up with when I was a child. It was really an amazing experience. It's a wonderful visit. But I also learned that Disney had no interest in the exchange. What they wanted me for was to help work on the design of the Space Mountain ride at the new Disney World. That was not a diversion that I wanted, so declined. But the other thing I learned in this was that there was only one studio that might possibly be interested in this new field of computer graphics, and they had no interest whatsoever. So there was no job there. So that meant the only other place I might possibly get a job would be in academia. So I went to various universities. At this time, computer graphics was not considered to be a legitimate part of computer science. It was a weird side effect, it was like an application, but it wasn't important in computer science. So almost no universities were interested, and the two who actually had programs, they weren't even in the computer science department. So there went that. I couldn't get a job. So fortunately, I got a call from the New York Institute of Technology, and the president of that school believed that computer graphics would become important sometime. So now we had somebody willing to invest in the development of computer graphics. That was the good news. The bad news was he believed the the programmers were going to replace the artists. Now, we knew that wasn't true, but he was also willing to pay for it. And so at that time, he bought 2 full-color frame buffers. So a frame buffer was like 512 by 512 resolution, somewhat higher than television resolution. Definitely looked better because it didn't go through the NTSC encoding. And we had 8 bits for each of the colors. And we had 2 of those, and they cost $180,000 each. So we had more memory for doing computer graphics than anybody else in the world. And the first person that I brought in was Alvy Ray Smith, who had been at Xerox PARC. And Xerox PARC, for some unknown reason, did not think that color belonged in the office. So they weren't willing to fund it at PARC. Now, and that was a weird one, but they didn't. So now Alvy came out, and so the first time he could actually start to write some sort of paint and various things to get higher quality imaging. And of course, I wrote renders and 2D application programs too. So as I mentioned, Jim came out and we wrote that paper. But the thing I learned besides working on these algorithms was that managing was really interesting. And it wasn't my self-image. My self-image was I was a researcher. I had a long-term vision of what I wanted to do. So now that I was managing this group, I had these theories about how to manage the group. And the theories were only hire people who don't need to be managed and they're self-motivated. Okay? So that meant that if I did that, then I could do all this research and somebody else would solve those problems. And that didn't work out so well. It was like a wrong idea. And the truth is, I discovered as I left New York Tech, because 5 years later, George Lucas hired me to come to Lucasfilm to start a computer graphics group. I just think, okay, is that my phone? No, wait a minute, I put that in airplane mode. I could never figure things out because I was just in Ferrara for 3 weeks, and the church bells rang like 17 minutes before the hour. I have no idea why that was. Okay, so when George hired me, and I left New York Tech to come out, it was a time to do a reset. So I could look at that time and say, okay, I had some theories about what to do, and about half of my theories were just plain wrong. And what I learned from that time was that that notion of being wrong half the time, and what I believed was, that will probably happen over and over again. Unfortunately, it has. But for me, it was one of the things I learned. It's like, I'm just wrong a lot. We had, actually, a lot of the people came out to Lucasfilm because that was pretty exciting. What was exciting about it was we'd been trying for years, including while at New York Tech, to get some studios, in particular Disney, to invest in computer graphics, in computer animation, with no luck. So now, with Star Wars, for the first time in the industry, a person with credibility was willing to invest in it. So this was in 1979 when I came out to Lucasfilm in Mill Valley. They weren't Mill Valley, but in Marin County. And it was a pretty remarkable time. And George wanted to invest in 3 different areas. There was computer graphics, which included compositing, also digital editing, and video editing, so digital audio and video editing. So these were like the 3 main areas. So I hired Alvy to come out and run the graphics, then I found somebody else to run these other groups. But at this point I thought, well, basically working with him creatively about how they work with each other is pretty exciting. Now, I was still doing technical work, but it was being phased out as my mental self-image was changing, because I didn't want to lose that root of keeping up on the technical side and the math and the science of it, because it was exciting. It's like, I liked all of this. Another thing that did happen at New York Tech, which was good, was that I decided that I want to publish everything we did at SIGGRAPH. And the reason for that was I knew we were a long ways away from our goal. There was no reason to think that we could or should keep secrets. And that if we participated in this community deeply and broadly, we were more likely to attract good people. That was the underlying premise. Now we get to Lucasfilm. George wants to affect the industry, so he supports the fact that we should publish everything that we do. He has no problem whatsoever with it. And here was the big surprise. 6 years later, after getting there, Steve Jobs bought us. And Steve supported my decision to publish everything. He never questioned it. This is surprising to people because Steve is known for being somewhat on the secretive side. But Steve knew that in this case, it was really about getting the best people. And that's why he supported it. And then basically when Disney acquired us even later, I was a little worried at the beginning, but by this time I had a lot of credibility, frankly. So if somebody objected, sort of like, okay, I have enough ability to say, no, we really should do it. And they said, okay, whatever you say. And the result was the last several years between Disney and Pixar, they had the majority of the papers. I mean, not the majority, a bigger share of the papers than anybody else. And it's just that believing in that principle is like you participate in the community. It's where you find friends, colleagues, and other people, and they know that this is a place where they can come and contribute. Okay, so I said I was going to stay on my script here, but I'm going all over the place. Now, at the time we were starting at Lucasfilm, we were not the only ones that had this goal of making an animated film. There were competitors. And the thing about them was they were secretive, and they got the funding, though, to buy a $10 million Cray 1 computer. All right, now, I'm a Lucasfilm. Lucas has more money than that. All right, but we just, pull out the paper and just did the calculation. And based upon the exponential growth rate for computing power, and based upon our assumptions about what it would take to create a feature-length film, we would need 100 Cray 1 computers, costing 1/10 of just what one costs. That it wouldn't be practical. So basically we needed, it's like 4 orders of magnitude improvement. There's a lot to do in the meantime. So let's do that first before trying to spend the money. And that would take basically 14 to 15 years in order to get that kind of improvement. Now, coincidentally, it took 15 years before Toy Story came out. So we were, and it took the amount of compute power we thought it was going to take. But that's part of like, okay, think through the implications of what you've got. And if you're going to take on some crazy ass vision, you damn well better think through the implications about what it's going to take to get there. And it's pretty hard to get right because it's like a range. And a lot of times people get the range wrong because they get ahead of themselves. You know, think self-driving cars or metaverse or something like that. It's like, okay, is it going to happen someday? Yeah. Okay, is it going to happen in 5 years? No. Okay, and it's like the publicity kicks in, it screws people's up, it gets articles that are written about it, and people begin to believe the hype. Not good. And the same thing happened with artificial intelligence, right? You know, it went through these 2 winters. Well, part of it was, oh, the computer can be used for ... Didn't live up to it. Boom, it's got the funding on it, so that's the first winter. And meanwhile, there's arguments within it, and so people that were promoting neural networks didn't have enough compute power, so that was, you know, made second class according to this, and they got some funding again, and that didn't work. So, like, there's this history of over-promoting something without understanding and thinking through the full implications about how hard it's going to be, even if you can say it's likely going to happen. Okay, so at the time at Lucasfilm, because we wanted to do film resolution images, the computers at that time did not have nearly enough memory. So we put together a hardware team and we built a film resolution memory with a computer for it called the Pixar Image Computer. And it turns out that was used, ILM used it. Incidentally, we weren't part of ILM, we were the separate computer division. And we had groups within Lucasfilm who were then, could be the users of it. And this is very important to us. Like, as technical people, we knew a lot about technically, but we didn't have domain expertise. And if I look at those 3 projects, in the case of video editing, the video editors didn't want the computer editing, even though it was, at the time, superior in terms of time. It was too different and they couldn't get their head around it. So the customer within the company to use it actually kind of tanked it. All right, ended up getting sold to Avid. And then the audio guy for the company was open to it, but it's not a big market. ILM was neutral. They weren't opposed to what we were doing, nor were they advocates of it. They were neutral. Now, the cool thing about this, though, was that by being neutral, they're saying they're focused on solving the problem. These guys were the grandmasters of film and optical and chemical technologies to get the special effects on the screen. They were very good at it. But they weren't attached to their process they had mastered. What they wanted was the result, so that when we delivered something for them, they were open to it. Now, within Lucasfilm, we had to solve the problem, though, of creating these images. So we formed a team with me and Lauren Carpenter and Rob Cook. At this time, the state of the art was 40,000 polygons in an image. All right, so we did our calculation, and the calculation was that in order to get a film quality image, we would need 80 million little polygons. So we had a ways to go. And so based upon what Lauren Carpenter did, he came up with something to deal with the complexity. Rob Cook had been brought in because he's so good at lighting and shading and thinking through things. And so we worked together from this, starting to solve these problems, and ultimately came up with something called RAISE. Stands for renders everything you ever saw. So, okay, this worked pretty well. And then as we got close to it, one of our people, the original people at Lucasfilm with our group, named is Tom Porter, he got the conceit or the conception that you can spread these samples out in time and get motion blur. So motion blur is a little technical, but it turns out for film projection, it was critical in order for it to be used in motion picture films. So suddenly, after all this work, a lot of solutions were coming together. And RAISE actually was the thing that embodied what that was. Okay, so the thing about change is change does happen, and George Lucas found it necessary to sell the division because he got a divorce, to be honest. He wanted the company and she got the cash. So now he was cash poor, and so he decides to sell the company, and Steve Jobs bought us. Now, Alan Kay had introduced us to Steve Jobs, and Steve was interested, and then Steve disappeared from the map. Well, it turns out the reason he disappeared was he was in this giant struggle within Apple that he lost. So he left, and then it turns out as we were trying to get sold, which was not going well, I ran into Steve Jobs at a SIGGRAPH conference, purely by coincidence. He now had formed his new company Next. Now he was interested in talking again. So that led to him acquiring Pixar. And so that's when the company was formed. So we began to sell these Pixar image computers. Now, none of us had ever sold anything or marketed anything before. Steve didn't know anything about high-end products. So basically, a bunch of engineers were making this product to be sold in different industries without any of us knowing what we were doing. It's kind of cool, actually, but I learned a lot from it. I always thought manufacturing must be some kind of mundane thing that was there, and discovered that the way Toyota thought about manufacturing was actually really fascinating. There was something about the incremental step-by-step process that they were using in figuring out how to make things better, more reliable, which is pretty profound. And so that did have an effect on us and on me. But I have to say is that in the end, even though we sold a bunch of these, we realized that essentially we're still up against Moore's Law. So Moore's Law is just like this drumbeat of exponential improvement over time, and that as a small company, we could not keep up with that. But we had a contract with Disney because we'd written a program to color cells. And that was our relationship with Disney. It was the beginning of our relationship. And it was dependent upon the hardware that we built, and we couldn't stay in the business of making this equipment and exist. So we sold the hardware business to another company so they would keep on making it, and we entered into another contract with Disney to port the software over onto Silicon Graphics boxes because that was now a viable machine for doing it. And that led to a level of trust with Disney because the one thing I didn't want to do was to screw them. Now, that led to other consequences, but that's a whole different story. Okay, so as I mentioned, Steve was there. I worked for Steve longer than anybody else. And just to be honest, I saw him go through this pretty phenomenal arc. There's the image of Steve, like the public image. I knew that Steve, and that early stuff was in fact the way it was. But then I saw he was changing. He's so smart that he figured out that that wasn't working. And so I saw this change in the person until around the early 1990s when he actually figured things out. And it was a pretty dramatic change. And so again, that's a different story, but I tell people this because the image of Steve, actually, that people sometimes have is that sort of bad boy affects the world. That isn't what happened. This is more of the hero's journey, where the person goes into the wilderness because they made a bunch of mistakes, and they make some more mistakes, and they come back changed. And it was the changed person that made the new apple. Okay, so Jim Clark, meanwhile, is from Silicon Graphics, and we've got this renderer that we're about to sell, and Jim Clark approached me and said, why don't all these companies get together and let's agree on a standard for rendering. So 19 companies got together to come up with a standard. And one of the things I did, which I'm really proud of, is I appointed a single person to be in charge of that architecture. And that was Pat Hanrahan. So Pat was he's really smart. He listens to people very carefully, and he puts all this together. And so he's like the principal architect, listening to these other 19 companies. And along the way, this was named RenderMan. So RenderMan then became a product that we sold, but it was also a standard that other people could and still can write to. Around this time, I should say, after starting this, Jim Clark was forced out of Silicon Graphics. And now, Jim is a very strong person, has a very strong personality, is a very passionate person. And I remember being with him in the elevator once. And at this time, Silicon Graphics was one of the workstation companies. And the workstation companies were in a heated war with each other. It was brutal. They all had different versions of Unix. Who thought that was a good idea? It's just idiocy, but they did. Because they thought, well, that's their competitive advantage. It wasn't their competitive advantage, it was a waste of time. I'm sorry, I'm getting carried away here. So it was an elevator with Jim, and Jim said that the guy who replaced him, or kicked him out of Silicon Graphics, believed that their chief competitor was Sun Computer, a major workstation company. And Jim said, he doesn't get that the real competitor is Apple. It's because Jim understood the implications of exponential change. Okay, so meanwhile, in the broader area of SIGGRAPH and the whole computer graphics community, while the initial focus was how do you make images look realistic, as they started to look realistic, the focus changed into how do you address the issues of modeling, simulation, complexity. How do you model hair? How do you render the flow of water? So there's all these simulation things that are now generating lots of papers, all this academic work on advancing all the different elements of image making. How do you control, even if you can simulate a natural phenomenon, how do you control those simulations for the purpose of meeting a story? It was an inspirational time and an inspiring time. And this is the time in which ILM and the effects industry now embraced computer graphics. Again, they didn't have preconceived notions about the way they used to work, or the fact that they were really incredibly good at it. They didn't care. It's how do they get to be better at what they're doing. So that was the first period. Right? Second period happens a little bit faster. The second period kind of starts around 1991 to 1995. This is the pivotal period. In 1991, Terminator 2 was released. It had a character that was a major character that was computer graphics, CG. Beauty and the Beast was released with that ballroom sequence. And Pixar signed a deal with Disney to make Toy Story. So that was 91. By this time, the pace of advance is increasing, as was the speed of computers. In 1993, Jurassic Park came out. This signals to the whole film industry that everything was about to change. Followed in 1995 by Toy Story. So 91 to 95 is when the industry went through it's like a big step change, and they accepted the use of technology. Now, from our point of view, that step change was a result of a lot of work leading up to it. So what I'm really referring to is a step change in perception. But that was important, that perception changed. In that same period of time, because I mentioned the computers are getting faster, the PCs are getting faster. And it was around this time when John Carmack basically was pushing to have Wolfenstein. I'm sorry, I never played this game, but Wolfenstein was a PC game using graphics accelerators. And so this is when the games industry kind of moved away from the arcade stuff to being on the PC. And in 1993, NVIDIA was formed. And part of this was to meet the needs of this growing games industry. So NVIDIA was one of those producing games, and they basically almost went under. Things didn't go right, and they'd made some decisions. At one point, incidentally, there were 50 different companies trying to make boards for PCs. It's actually a little out of control there. In one of their existential moments, then NVIDIA, in order to survive, decided they had to turn a chip in 6 months, which they did. All right, with an unheard of rate, because normally what happens is you verify something is going to work, you do all this stuff, because when you're done with it, you want it to be done. Rather, it was, okay, we're done in 6 months, and whatever works, we're shipping that. But it worked for them. So it started a culture of turning the chip every 6 months. Okay, so now they're selling into the games industry. Now the thing is, when it comes to graphics cards and graphics chips, the film industry and the academic industry, which are doing the really cool stuff, they can't afford, they're not big enough to have chips built for them. But the games industry was big enough. But where do you get the ideas and the things that go into these boards and these chips, the algorithms? Where do you get them? They're in SIGGRAPH. They're in the academic community because they've been working on algorithms, display algorithms, and simulation, all of which requires a large number of matrix multiplies. But once they release these chips into the games industry and they make their money from it, then the boards are also sold at the same time into academia and into the special effects like Pixar, and we were buying all this stuff. We could do more work because now we have faster computers. And we do this more work, and then we publish them in SIGGRAPH, and NVIDIA and their competitor was AMD. NVIDIA would come to SIGGRAPH to learn the latest algorithms to then put into the chips. So we ended up with this cycle that went on. Nobody planned this, nobody was in charge of it, but you had this really interesting cycle where the rate of improvement in computer speed was faster than it was for Moore's Law for several years. So around 2009 to 2012, it became clear to a lot of people that these games GPUs could be useful for something other than games. So it started to be used for scientific applications. And meanwhile, there are people who've been working on neural networks. Frankly, neural networks, I think the first paper on that goes back in 1948. I mean, the idea's been around a long time. There've been a small group of people trying to make it work. When all of a sudden a number of exponential things come together, one is the amount of data on the internet, large centers, but you still need to have something there with a lot of compute power to do it, and now the GPU is available to do that. So now we have a completely unexpected result that's coming out of a SIGGRAPH academia, games and chip industry, which now enables something entirely different. So computer graphics started off marginalized and not considered to be legitimate, and the neural networks didn't survive those first few things. And they ended up being core to the advancement that's going on now, which is going at a pretty phenomenal pace, and it's pretty unpredictable, except that a lot of things are changing because of this. So these are connections which aren't obvious, but you go from the margin to the center, and it's like this thrilling ride. That's why I say it was like a roller coaster ride. You know, and of course I can only tell bits and pieces of what took place from my point of view. And while I've highlighted the change and a few of the lessons along the way and the exponential part, I have to say that for all of this, I'm so grateful for the values of the people that I've worked with over these years, their thoughtfulness, and their passion to make a difference. And these are the mentors and the colleagues in this growing community, and it's been a great joy. So with that, let me open it up to any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Ed. Tour de force. I took about 6 pages of notes, learned things I didn't know I needed to know, and I have a whole list of movies now I didn't know I also needed to know. We're going to have a time for some questions here, about 10 minutes, 15 minutes of questions directly for Ed, and then Marcus, Ed and I are going to have a little bit of a conversation about a few things. So who has a question they would like to ask? Does anyone have a question?
Or does anybody have an answer?
Or a challenge? We've got one here. Anybody else have a question? Come on, this is a smart crowd. We've got a couple over here, a woman in the white shirt in here. Go ahead. So we'll take about 2 questions and we'll see how they go. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Just thank you for everything. My question is, how do you bring these smart people together to work on a big problem with a long term instead of them focusing on short-term goals, as you mentioned, with everyone developing their own Unix system or something. How do you,
Well, to be honest, a lot of this was the fact that at the first 3 places I was at was Utah, New York Tech, and Lucasfilm. They took a long-term view. And for me, what it means is any institution or company should take a long-term view out of a number of things. That is, you got to take care of the business and the knitting. You have to do that. But you can't forget about the long term. And so that was absolutely invaluable to have that kind of support. The other one was that when you're doing something new, everybody's, figuring things out. And it's like, you don't really come up with answers. The way you think about your progress is, and this is true with the arts, right? Artists have to live within limitations, and technology, you've got to live within limitations. So you've got your limitations, but your job then is to figure out things in the limitations. And once you solve problems, then you look for the next limits. So it's a mindset. And sure enough, I do find people that kind of get stuck on the way that they're doing things, or they've got a short-term view. They aren't, I mean, some of them actually just need good managing. Let's say the thing about, trying to get people to self-manage was, what I learned was that some people are actually very good, they just need managing. So sometimes if people get stuck on something short-term, it's because they're actually in an environment which has encouraged short-term thinking rather than the long-term. It's a long, complicated answer, but it's not only how you think about it, it's how your colleagues think about it and what's valued, and your desire to participate in a broader community.
But let me ask you, can I follow up on that? Because you had to produce film after film. I mean, you were working on film on not on a 2-3 yearly tact. These are all like on multiple films at the same time.
Oh yeah, that was great figuring that out, because you're right. Once we were a public company, then we had to produce a film basically every year, and got to the point where it was like every 8 months.
Right, so you were...
We're doing. Well, the thing was, each one still took...
Say again, I'm sorry?
Each film still took 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
So we did develop our own way of thinking about it, which was, I think, unique in the industry. And part of it became when we were doing our third film, which is Toy Story 2. We had a development group, and we were trying to do what other studios do, which is you have a group that's reading scripts, looking for a good idea to make into a film. And it's a longer story, but what I learned from that was we were about to make a huge mistake. We were copying a flawed model. And that what had made us work, which is the thing we had to focus on, is we wanted to pick someone because they had the passion to be a good storyteller and to lead people. So from that point on, and this is still true, is like we never tell people what to do. In fact, when we think somebody can direct a film, we will say to them, go come up with 3 ideas. We don't tell them what the ideas are. We say, come up with 3 ideas. Now, there's a reason for saying 3 ideas. It's that if you're trying to solve a problem, you can end up banging your head against the wall. I mean, you've all been there, right? It's like, I've got to solve this problem, and you get kind of caught. So the reason for 3 was to say, as soon as you get stuck, switch to another idea. So back and forth with a 3. And they'll do this for a year. And then at the end of the year, they'll pitch it to us. Now, the same thing happens every time. There really is one that they want to make, right? But they start the meeting by saying, I love all 3 ideas equally, and it doesn't matter to me which one you pick. All right, so they all say that. They've been in these rooms with other people who said it, but they always say it. So when we meet, they think the discussion is about, okay, which of the ideas is the best. That's actually not what the discussion is about when they've left the room. It's which one do they really want to make? Right. So, and my favorite was Coco, where Lee Unkrich started off, and he's been in all these meetings, because it's still the same BS. I love all 3 ideas equally. So it's 1/2 hour on the first idea, good idea. Second idea, good idea. For the third idea, we had to go in a different room because there are only 2 long walls in the story rooms, and each one requires. So we go into the other room, open the door, both walls, the ceiling, and the table are covered with Mexican artwork. Without anybody saying a word, we know which film we're making. And that's what we're looking for. And so the way we do it is like, okay, find the person who's got the passion and then put the team around that.
But sorry, I'm going to ask another question. You said something that really intrigued me, especially for us here at our institution in general, which was we decided to publish everything, to make it, but we know that this industry is cutthroat and brutal, at least from the outside in, with all the competition between the studios, for actors, for scripts, for good ideas. How did you reconcile this cutthroat Hollywoodness with making everything free?
Well, in terms of, we only had one exception to this, and it had to do with the politics between DreamWorks and Disney, unfortunately. But we were friends with all these other companies. So Blue Sky and PDI, they were all our friends, and we went together. And so I got calls from everybody, right after Toy Story came out, thanking us for opening the door because that's what they wanted to do and that we gave them a chance. And we were good friends with them. We wanted them to succeed. Now, I know there are elements within it, but it isn't quite true it's cutthroat in that sense, because you don't want any films competing with yours when it's released. That's true. Mm-hmm. At that point, your competitors can die and burn in hell, all right, for that 2-week period.
Yeah.
But you actually want them to be successful the rest of the year because you want people to enjoy going to the movies.
Yes.
And if they have a bad experience, then they're going to stop going, and that hurts you. So, other than your little competitive slot, well, we enjoy movies. Like somebody else does a great job, like Sony did their Spider-Man and the Spider-Verse.
That's good.
It was the best film of the year. It beat out a Pixar and a Disney film. It was better.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's no point in saying, no, it wasn't. No, actually it was. They did a great job. They didn't have a model to repeat it because that team disbanded afterwards. Oh. So for us, the question is not, can we do something good? Because you can do something good. And sometimes other studios and films do a great piece of work. Our challenge is, how do we have a culture where we're supporting each other and we're staying together and everybody has a vested interest in each other's success? And that's the most important thing for us, is you have vested interest in other people doing well, including your competitors.
That's a really great lesson. Really good to hear that from you, and a great lesson. Let's go ahead and take your question here, and then Marcus, I'm going to have you come up here and join us, if you don't mind.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. Since you mentioned a lot of times very visionary aspects, do you have any tips for other students and researchers who are also trying to have an impact long-term in the industry? I can just give an example. I'm currently trying to research on accessible computer graphics, for example, for visually impaired users, because I have the vision that I think with metaverses and all these topics, which will be a part of our society long-term, that we have to convince people. So I'm still, it would be nice to hear, like, how can we have an impact for the next generations, and how can we share these visions with others so that people will invest?
Well, there are two parts to that. One of them is, I believe one of the greatest assets we have is when people have the passion to do some good. Right? That's a tremendous energy. And I've been places where they don't actually think in those terms. I give an example. It's a phrase I've heard people use, like, our assets go home at night. Well, why do we call our people assets? Right? They're people with passions. So they're not assets, they're people. And so part of it is just a recognition that I want to work with people who've got passion and want to do something that's good. And there are places and organizations where people support that, and that's a place to be. And it's one of the reasons for actually, being open about what we're doing, is you're also signaling, what are your values? What are your values? What do you care about? What do you think about? And what kind of difference do you want to make? And so how do you line yourself up with people who are going to support and share that? And how do you help create that for other people? Because it isn't just like, how am I given a chance? How do I give somebody else a chance? Because some people, they aren't given the chance. So we just make it a habit of supporting other people. And do we always get the support ourselves? Not necessarily. But we can approach our life with others to do that, and then try to be in a place where we get support.
So I'm going to ask Marcus a question. You've worked with Ed for many, many years, and he's been you said to us earlier, he's been a great supporter of you. He just mentioned something about culture and how to help make sure a great team continues to be great. I mean, can you have any anecdote to share about that and what maybe a lesson you've taken from Ed that you could share with us? And I didn't warn you about this question, so I apologize. But I just, I'm struck by what he said and about what I know about you.
No, first of all, I'm incredibly grateful because, as said, can you hear me? Yeah, as said, Ed was such a dear mentor to me over the last 15 years, and without him, I had not managed to steer Disney research through all those rocky waters of the corporate Hollywood and Disney. We also probably share a lot our disgust for bullshit. Which unfortunately happens in these corporate environments, and we always, whenever we meet, we share anecdotes about things where you basically have to fight against the bullshit and the nonsense. But so far, so good. I think with Ed's help, we successfully made it. What I learned is specifically, and I think, Ed, you repeated this many times, if you really want to build a great place, and that really stuck with me over all those years, you have to have the greatness and the ability to hire people who are smarter than yourself. And I think this was one of the fundamental principles I've been trying to sort of keep for Disney research over all these years, and I'm incredibly grateful and proud of the group, which all of them are in their way smarter than I am, and that's totally fine. I'm totally happy with it, and this is really how you build a world-class place. Would you agree? Mm-hmm. That's one, and the second one is totally when Bob and I basically were the ones that started Disney research, when we came out of academia with all of our naive thinking about how animation would go, in a company like Pixar or feature animation. But then when for the first time we get exposed to the actual process, which is usually hidden from the public, as an academic, you don't have easy access to it, to the intrinsics, especially not to the artists who run the underlying story. So that was really insightful. And I would say half of the papers we published at SIGGRAPH over the last 15 years, they would not have come into place because we simply hadn't gotten the idea. It's so much changed my perspective onto research as a whole, especially onto computer graphics research. So that's certainly the most remarkable ones.
That's cool. Thank you. Another question before I ask him one? I can keep asking these guys questions all night, but we're going to end. We're already 15 minutes over time. We're going to end in about 5-6 minutes. So here, I have the woman up here on the left, and there's another microphone over here to the woman over here, please. Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. So you were just saying it was an exponential ride. I believe it's not over. What will be your next stop?
Ooh, nice question. There you go. Your next stop.
Well, the thing about all natural exponential processes is they come to an end.
Yeah.
No, I retired 2 years ago, so essentially I've done some consulting, but basically I've been working on a revision to my book. I finally this finally got cleared recently. And that basically consists of addendums to 4 of the chapters and 2 additional chapters. So that's taken a lot of time. But the other is to go out and talk with groups, talk with people. And I find that exciting. It's just, to be honest, I don't have the energy to like a full-time job. I'm just, it's like, it's the recognition that it's time to pass it on. And at Disney Animation and at Pixar Animation, I basically picked people and groomed people to be my successors. And when you do that, at some point, you let them be the successor. Otherwise, it's just hollow. And Jim Morris is the president of Disney Animation, and he used to be the president of ILM. And I hired him because I thought he could be my successor.
That's great. All right, thank you. Marcus just whispered a question in my ear. I'm going to let him ask that because he'll ask it better.
We have probably a
You have to turn your mic on.
or members from the art school.
Okay, you got it.
Here, and so I think one of the questions would be, how do you see the evolution? So we talk a lot about next-gen storytelling at Disney, right? Whatever this is, nobody really knows what it is. But so what is your projection into the future? Do you think we will continue to tell stories in a linear medium as a film, or do you see any evolution of the way we will tell stories in the future?
Where is it going? Storytelling, where is it going?
Well, storytelling is our way of communicating with people, has been through our history. And part of it is like when you read a book to a child, right? It's a personal communication. But if you look at, let's say, not just movies or books or television, but novels or books or stories or folk tales, or articles in magazines, their way of passing on information. And there's an art to doing a good job of it. It's like if you read a good magazine article versus the weak ones, you recognize some of them are actually really written well, and you're compelled to want to read them. So, well, I'd say that the linear storytelling that you see on film or television and now streaming, has got a kind of form which where the stories are typically follow that form. Not all. I mean, sometimes people break the rules to good effect. Sometimes they break it and it doesn't work. If you look at the nonlinear ways, then they're still under development. So if you think of it's games where for the most part it's reactive and based upon certain things that happen, sometimes they take you into a world. It's still being worked out and developed. When the Oculus came out, then there was all the publicity like this. Basically, VR is now the new big thing, and I think the publicity thing kicked off. Well, the fact is, as I mentioned, it's over 50 years old. All that happened with the Oculus was that the lag time went away. Right?
Yeah.
It's important, but it's a perceptual important thing, but it really doesn't say anything about the storytelling thing. And people have been trying to think about storytelling for a long time. But this is a case of where the hype machine gets in the way, because instead of saying this should be a commercial thing and we're going to build a business around it, it's like, no, this is worth experimenting with. I don't know the answer to it. I know that with virtual reality that sometimes the environment is a character. There's certain things that you can do with it. But to say what it is, I don't know. I won't pretend to know. But that's the whole point is the reason you have some people try something is to have them try new ideas. So I don't know the answer to it, but I think that it's the kind of thing you say, well, let people experiment with it. They'll try certain things. A lot of them will fail, and some will actually come to fruition. And I went through that process.
And as you said earlier, sometimes it takes a long time. This is a quote.
Right.
Sometimes it takes a long time to get shit done.
That's right.
That's my Now, Ed and Marcus and crowd, I'm sorry. We have time afterwards. There's an apéro upstairs, outside, which you're very welcome to join us. But we do need to wrap it up now. I'm sure you have questions, so do I. I'd love to keep asking you questions. We can't. Ed, thank you so very, very, very much for coming tonight with us and to sharing your thoughts. Really wonderful. And I want to thank Marcus for making this all happen, and for the department for helping making it happen. Don't go away quite yet. It's really fantastic that you were able to do this. So
thank you very
thank
much
you.
for hosting and for having been such a great moderator of the whole event. And once again, thanks for accepting our invitation. I want to close with an anecdote. When to the point, computer graphics is not part of computer science. When I joined ETH as a young professor 30 years ago, I ran in the cafeteria, I ran into our honorable Turing Award winner, Niklas Wirth. And he said, you are the new professor here. So yes. What are you doing? Computer graphics. And he said, I didn't know that this is part of computer science, which actually, yes, was not so nice to hear from such a celebrity back in the day. But anyways, times have changed, On that note, let's go to the apéro.
Let's have a drink. Thank you.